and the leader of the House, Penny Mordaunt, are widely expected to run. Those vying for the Tory party leadership will have to secure 100 nominations from the party's 357 MPs. The leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey, told GBNews there needs to be a general election.
I don't think any political party before has made such a mess, and the Conservative parties are totally to blame for this shambles. And, you know, I'm a patriot. I believe in my country. I want to serve my country to help people get out of this mess. And frankly, if the Conservatives were truly patriotic, they would vote for that general election so the British people could have their say.
High street stores are feeling the pinch, with the latest figures showing another sales slump last month. Retail sales fell by 1.4%, which is much worse than analysts expected. The Office for National Statistics says food stores saw the biggest drop, with sales falling by 1.8%. The figures reflect ongoing concerns about the cost of living, as well as shop closures during the Queen's state funeral. And a hospital's regulator is warning maternity services in England are the worst they've ever been. The Care Quality Commission says it has deep concerns about the level of care given to mothers and babies, with 2 in 5 maternity units now ranked as inadequate. Its report has found continual issues with leadership and culture, referring to the failings in the NHS as systemic. TV online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Tom with the briefing live from Downing Street.
Good morning, it's 9:35 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, live on your TV and indeed your radio. I'm standing here in Downing Street, a street where more moving vans are being seen than just about any other street in the country at the moment. And before we dive into speaking to some of our excellent thought-leading guests, I want to take a look at the state in the polls, because yesterday the company People Polling asked the British people, a representative sample, what exactly they believe would be the best party to lead the country at the next general election. And these are the results. The Labour Party has 53% support. That's from the People poll yesterday. Yet the Tories extraordinarily have crashed down to 14%. In this one poll, that is the lowest rating the Conservatives have ever got since the beginning of polling in this country. So how do they get out of this mess? Well, the same poll asked the British public who they would like to be the next Prime Minister out of the Conservative options. Here are the results. Rishi Sunak leads on just 19%, Boris Johnson 16%, Penny Mordaunt 5%. But fascinatingly, perhaps most fascinatingly of all, when you look at just those who voted Conservative at the last election in 2019, when the Tories won that historic 80-seat majority, out of those voters, Boris Johnson leads 38% to Rishi Sunak's 20% to Penny Mordaunt's 8%. Fascinating differential there between voters as a whole and those 2019 Conservative voters, perhaps indicative of Conservative members. But it's not just this country that's been looking at our political situation. Extraordinarily, last night, Ukraine, yes, the official Twitter account for Ukraine, tweeted the most extraordinary graphic. It said, "Better call Boris." Now, Boris Johnson is an incredibly popular figure in Ukraine, received a Medal of Honor as he was leaving his position as Prime Minister, a good friend of Zelensky as well. It must be said, that tweet from the official Ukraine Twitter account was deleted around 8 hours later. No doubt a little bit worrying there in terms of international relations, but fascinating to see just how popular Boris Johnson is in Ukraine. One final thing I think we should all update ourselves on is the tally of MP backers. The Guido Fawkes website has been tracking the number of backers for each of the potential candidates. And at the moment, Boris Johnson is in the lead, 52 supporters. Now, you need to get to 100 to get nominated on Monday, so 3 days MPs to go. However, Boris Johnson on 52, followed a few behind by Rishi Sunak, and then quite a few behind that, Penny Mordaunt. Of course, none of these candidates have officially declared yet. Still a lot to play for, but these early times really count. Let's explore the dynamics of this race now with Tim Montgomery, the founder of the Conservative Home website, a former advisor to Boris Johnson and indeed a senior GB News contributor. Tim, is it really possible that we could see the return of Boris Johnson?
Yes, it is, Tom. And I would have, if you'd asked me that question yesterday afternoon, I think I would have said no. And I think the big message I sent to all of our viewers this morning is keep tuned, really, because this is a fast-moving situation. I have underestimated the support that Boris Johnson has amongst the parliamentary party and probably amongst the Conservative Party as a whole. But I think what's driving this is the opinion poll that you've just been quoting, Tom, to our viewers. When the Tories are down on 14%, 14%, that is frightening Tory MPs to death. And I think they are beginning to think, who can turn this round? And I think they know that Boris Johnson is a huge risk, but in exactly the way he rescued the Conservative Party in 2019, when the Tory party had finished 5th in the European elections behind the Greens and, in single digits, they're turning to Boris Johnson potentially again as the one person who can change the dynamics of politics. The big question, though, I have in my own mind, I don't know what your answer to it would be, is does Boris Johnson, post-pandemic, post-Partygate, post all the events we're all familiar with, have that same draw with the electorate that he did 4 years ago?
Yes, a really fascinating question. And of course, big questions for Boris Johnson next month. That investigation, that Parliamentary Privileges Committee investigation into Boris Johnson, how he behaved over Partygate, whether or not there was indeed cake and wine in the cabinet room. To some extent, they seem like more minor issues in the context of the financial situation our country finds itself in. But interesting nonetheless. One thing I do want to raise, though, I've been talking to some MPs who've been sticking around in Westminster, no doubt many MPs staying in Westminster this weekend as opposed to going back to their constituencies. A couple of people I've been speaking to this morning are saying they're not necessarily surprised with the names who have declared for Boris Johnson. Their argument was that all of the people declaring for Boris Johnson now were the sort of last guard who were with him until the end just a few months ago, and that they are all coming out quickly now. It might be harder for Boris Johnson to get his next 50 MPs, whereas his first 50 MPs were relatively easy.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of people who definitely want to stop Boris are telling themselves. I'm not so convinced by that, actually. I think the big thing that has changed is that opinion poll you quite rightly started this analysis with. Not just, of course, our opinion poll, it's the opinion polls that we've seen from other pollsters as well. And, we shouldn't forget that in the no confidence vote that Boris Johnson narrowly won while he was still Prime Minister, it was quite narrow. I think it was about 200, wasn't it, to 150, more or less, which wasn't enough to depose him, but was enough to sort of send the signal that he was in trouble. But 200 Conservative MPs did back him in that confidence vote. It was a secret ballot, yet they still supported him. So the big thing I'm hearing from people in and around the 1922 committee, the committee that governs the elections inside the parliamentary party, is some people thought that the threshold for taking part in this election should be near 120, perhaps even 150. And part of that motivation was to stop Boris being involved in this contest at all. And because there's some now people thinking he is going to clear that 100 threshold, but perhaps he might not have cleared the 120, 150 threshold. Because once he gets over that 100 threshold, if he gets in front of party members, there is every chance he can win.
Of course, there'll be a rapid succession after the nominations are in. If the nominations, and there could be up to 3 candidates split across with just over 100 nominees each, then there'll, of course, be parliamentary votes. One of the fascinating things here, just finally, is that those parliamentary votes, instead, unlike last time, where they finished with the final 2 that then went to the membership, Amongst MPs, there will be a vote on the final two, not a definitive vote, but an indicative vote. So we will know who the MPs would have chosen, and that could be a different candidate to who the members end up choosing.
Absolutely. And, you know, one thing, there's been quite a lot of flack directed at members in the media over the last 24 hours. They're getting blamed for choosing Liz Truss. As someone who founded that grassroots website you mentioned, Conservative Home, I think we should remember it was MPs who shortlisted Liz Truss. They only had the choice between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. So blaming the members entirely for what we've all been through over the last 6-7 weeks seems a bit unfair. So MPs shouldn't get too carried away with themselves. They have quite a responsibility for what's just happened, as well as grassroots members.
Wise words there. Tim Montgomery, thank you for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Let's continue this conversation on now with John Rentoul, the chief political commentator for The Independent. John, first of all, are we all going a little bit mad? Have we all forgotten where this country was? Was it sort of 3 months ago as the government appeared to be collapsing, maybe 4 months ago? Has all been forgotten? Has all been forgiven?
Well, I think there are elements of the Conservative Party who have taken leave of their senses if they think that Boris Johnson is the answer to their problems. I mean, you know, however unfair they may think it was to have got rid of Boris Johnson, he was got rid of for good reasons by the Parliamentary Party. So to now having imposed one candidate that the MPs didn't want on them, to impose a second candidate on them who the MPs don't want, because I'm sure Boris Johnson wouldn't actually command a majority in that indicative vote that you were talking about just there. I think would be a sign that the Conservatives have just given up and are not serious about winning the next election.
One of the fascinating points about the nomination process, nominations close, of course, on 2 p.m. on Monday, is that of those 100 names that must be attached to the nomination form of each potential candidate, only 2 of them need to be public, the proposer and the seconder. 98 of them can be entirely private. Might that help Boris Johnson?
Well, it might. It's obviously an attempt to try and reduce the temperature and the divisiveness of this election, because I mean the problem is that all MPs are now identified as supporting one candidate or another. But I mean most MPs went public with their views about Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, so we know broadly where people stand. I mean the problem, the only thing that I would say about that is it gives Guido Fawkes, who's compiling the list of nominations, the excuse to include anonymous supporters of Boris Johnson in the list, which makes Boris Johnson appear to be ahead of Rishi Sunak. But if you strip those out and just go for the public supporters, Rishi Sunak's well ahead.
Now, we must say that the man compiling most of that list, Christian Calgi, has written on a number of occasions that he has independently verified those anonymous names on that column for Boris Johnson, identifying them only as a party whip or as a 1922
I'm not questioning that at all, Tom.
member.
I mean, absolutely. But it's unfair to include those anonymous names and not to include anonymous supporters of Rishi Sunak. So to compare like with like, Rishi Sunak is well ahead, and he's the obvious choice. If the Conservatives manage to mess this up again, they will only have themselves to blame. I mean, I simply cannot believe that they really want to lose that badly. I mean, the one lesson from your opinion poll is that the Conservatives, that it is actually worth trying to do something to rescue some seats from the wreckage of the next election. I mean, even if the Conservatives can't win it, it would be worth trying not to lose it so badly. And I think Boris Johnson would be the wrong choice.
And yet, has the party sort of almost led itself to this position? Not just those MPs who have decried Liz Truss for what they interpret as going against the mandate of the 2019 election, but also, frankly, the Labour Party saying that this party has moved on so much from where it was in 2019 that it is no longer upholding the promises of 2019. Talking about the 2019 victory so much, talking about the 2019 manifesto so much, doesn't that just raise in the minds of MPs the man who won that election standing on that manifesto?
Yes, but the answer to that is if Boris Johnson has lost the confidence of the parliamentary party and the country, then you get someone else in to implement the 2019 manifesto, and I would have thought it makes more sense to do that than to go back to a discredited prime minister.
Well, John Rentoul, really appreciate your analysis as always. Thank you for joining us here on another momentous morning in British politics. Let's take a moment now to explore the legacy of Liz Truss and her few months in office. Apologies if the audio is a little bit difficult here. There is a massive delivery lorry just driving down Downing Street right now. You don't see that every day. But Chris Snowdon of the Institute of Economic Affairs joins us now on the briefing. And Chris, it's interesting, your think tank has been associated very closely with the premiership of Liz Truss. There have been some who have said that this was an IEA government. Is that true?
Well, no. I mean, obviously not. It was a Liz Truss government, and it was Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng who created that mini budget. In fact, there's something in The Guardian today pointing out that a couple of people associated with the IEA were warning Liz Truss about the potential effects on the financial markets. You know, she wasn't in power for long enough for her to implement any IEA policies if she was ever going to. So we shall never know. Certainly, she was a friend of the IEA for many years before she became prime minister. But, you know, I never saw a great deal of sign in terms of the kind of deregulation supply side policies that we would like to see. She was pro-economic growth, and that was great. And that's why, you know, many of my colleagues were supportive of her. But when it came down to it, we didn't get any pro-growth policies apart from possibly the legalization of fracking. What we got instead were just a lot of kind of unfunded tax cuts, and then nothing. You know, we were kind of waiting for the next stage of this pro-growth agenda, and it didn't come.
It's interesting. I've read what you have written in both the pages of the Mail, but also your own Substack website about the state of the economy, and frankly, how unlibertarian, if that is a phrase, the last government was. Indeed, the last 12 years have been. The scale of the debt burden growing, the level of taxation still at record highs. This wasn't really that right wing of a government, was it?
No, I mean, the tax changes mostly that were proposed were either bringing things back to the levels of 2021, or in the case of the 45p income tax rate, bringing back to the levels of 2009. So it wasn't particularly radical in a sense, other than, and this is quite important, that it was all being done on the Never Never. And everything's been done on Never Never in this country now for 20 years. And that's why we've ended up with £2.4 trillion of debt, rising debt interest payments. We are, as Liz Truss said when she became prime minister, a high tax, high regulation, low growth economy. I do believe she sincerely wanted to do something about that. And in a way, it's a shame that she won't get the chance to do it. I'm not sure that her successor will do either. But you know, my main point in those articles was to say that this meme about Liz Truss crashing the economy is simply not true. You know, the mini budget was a mistake. You know, what happened with the markets were bad. But the conversation about the economy has to start and end with inflation. And it's not Liz Truss's fault we've got 10% inflation. That goes back to printing a huge amount of money during COVID, very low interest rates for a very long time. That's why people are seeing their mortgage payments going up. Would you lend somebody money for 2 years fixed rate at 2% when inflation's at 10%? No, of course you wouldn't. Nobody would. And the problem with the mini budget was that the markets got the impression, quite rightly, I think, that the Bank of England wasn't doing very much about inflation. There was a huge fiscal splurge in the mini budget, which was only going to exacerbate inflation. So naturally, rates increased.
Well, Chris Snowdon, fascinating analysis as always. Really appreciate your time this morning on the briefing. And please do keep writing those articles. Really, really insightful analysis there. Richard Graham is our next guest. He's the Member of Parliament for Gloucester, Conservative Member of Parliament, of course. Richard, who are you backing in this leadership contest?
Well, I'm backing the one man whose competency, whose economic judgment and whose broad appeal to the country is absolutely right for this moment, and that's Rishi Sunak.
Now, I understand that you were backing Rishi Sunak last time round. Why do you think this time round it'll be different?
Well, if we'd had Rishi Sunak in the summer, we would have had a very different approach to the difficult economic problems that everybody in the whole of the continent of Europe, America, ourselves and all around the world are facing. And that would have been less likely to have spooked the markets and seen a drive up of the long bond rates, which also, of course, have an effect on mortgage rates and so on. So I think it was sad that there was an opportunity lost there. But look, we are where we are now, and this is now an opportunity to get it right second time.
Is there a worry here that this is almost becoming yet another psychodrama? Looking at the nominations, public as they are at this stage, this is looking like a Boris versus Rishi contest. Is there a worry that the people on the Boris side of the party and the people on the Rishi side of the party are just so intractably opposed that they can't come together again afterwards?
Well, look, I think the important thing is to focus on the situation as it is. And I hope that by the end of Monday evening that we have a new party leader and prime minister. And for those who hugely respect, as I do, Boris Johnson's great talents and skills, have to bear in mind very clearly the risk of him becoming Prime Minister again while he is still under investigation by the Privileges Committee. I cannot see any way the Privileges Committee will reach any other conclusion but that he misled Parliament. They may conclude that he misled Parliament knowingly, and that would be an extremely difficult decision because it would almost certainly result in the Prime Minister of the day, were he to be elected, actually being suspended from Parliament. I mean, that is not a way forward. It's a way back into all the difficult questions of what happened in number 10 during the pandemic. And I just don't think we want to go backwards. We need to go forwards. We have the solution to hand, and I just hope the party will recognise that and come together with a government that recognises all the talents and skills from across the different wings.
And yet, what do you say to those who say that the former Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, has precisely the same number of fines issued by the Metropolitan Police for breaches of COVID rules as the former Prime Minister?
Well, look, the key thing is, he's not under investigation by the Privileges Committee. And Rishi Sunak would come in as a new Prime Minister who had no involvement in the mistakes of the last month and who laid out a very clear economic platform, which we now need to see delivered. I believe that's what colleagues will respect and will want to see taken forward in a broad team. And that is the key to it, is to have the best of the talents from across the party.
Yes, one of the big mistakes, I suppose, that many people point to under Liz Truss is not having that broad reach out of cabinet, people from various sides of the party. But Richard Graham, really appreciate your thoughts as always. Thanks for joining us on the briefing this morning. Just one final point from me today. I find it absolutely fascinating how objectively Boris Johnson is the sort of big state, easy with higher taxes, liberal guy, could be argued as a one-nation conservative. He's being backed by the right of the party. Meanwhile, Mr. Fiscal himself, Rishi Sunak, who's much more concerned about deficit reduction, could be described as more Thatcherite perhaps, more of the right of the party, he's being backed by all of the lefties. It's a remarkable topsy-turvy world, but that's British politics in 2022. That's been it for me on the briefing this morning. I'll be back again Monday at 9:30.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.